After decades marked by battles and silence, Robert Hayes, a weary veteran, brings his only granddaughter Lily to a forgotten mountain cabin in Montana, hoping to rebuild what war and loss had stolen. Lily hasn't spoken more than a few words since her mother's passing, until a wounded German shepherd staggered to their door. They call him Ranger, but his scars carry secrets that will tie their family to a past Robert thought was buried forever. What they discover hidden in the woods will change both of their lives. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from, and if you believe in second chances, hit like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The winter sun hovered low above the Montana horizon, casting long, pale beams across an endless stretch of frozen land. Snow lay heavy on the shoulders of pine trees, their branches groaning under the weight, and the wind carried a knife-edged chill that stung the cheeks and froze the breath before it left the lips. The road into the mountains was little more than a gray ribbon, half concealed beneath icy ridges, twisting like a scar carved into the wilderness. It was February, the hardest month of the season, when even the locals prayed for spring and outsiders seldom ventured beyond the towns. Yet up this unforgiving road climbed a dented green pickup truck, its engine straining, tires biting the ice as if every turn might be its last. Behind the wheel sat Robert Hayes, a man of 62 whose face carried the deep-cut lines of both war and years of solitude. His frame was broad, but bowed by time. Shoulders, once squared by military discipline, now rounded with age. His skin bore the weathered tan of someone who had lived long outdoors, sun and wind carving permanence into his features. A silver beard, trimmed but uneven, shadowed his jaw, streaked with darker remnants of the youth he once had. His eyes, pale blue, like ice melting on stone, were sharp but weary, the kind that had seen more than they wanted to remember. Robert had served 20 years in the army, much of it overseas, where desert heat and the screams of battle had burned themselves into his memory. A roadside explosion in Kandahar had taken 3 of his men and left him with scars not visible on skin, but etched deep in the silence of his nights. After retirement he drifted, never truly settling, never truly at peace, until the death of his only daughter forced him into a role he had never expected: guardian of his granddaughter. In the passenger seat beside him, nestled in a thick parka with a fur-lined hood, was Lily, 12 years old, small for her age, her body slight as if the grief of losing. Her mother had pressed her into herself. Her face was pale against the glass, a delicate oval with freckles scattered across her nose and cheeks. Her hair, long and chestnut brown, tumbled from beneath her knitted hat and brushed against her shoulders, though it lacked the playful shine most children carried. Her hazel eyes seemed too old, as if she had inherited the sorrow of more than just her own years. Lily had not spoken much since the funeral. She expressed herself mostly in drawings, carrying a sketchbook wherever she went. In town, she had been quiet at school, quiet at church, quiet even when her teachers tried to coax her with kindness. Her silence worried Robert, though he was not a man given to expressing worry aloud. Instead, he offered his presence, his clumsy patience, and now this journey into the mountains. The truck crested a ridge and slowed. Robert's knuckles whitened around the wheel as he guided the vehicle carefully down toward a valley where a small clearing waited, framed by snow-thick woods. Nestled in that clearing was the cabin his father's cabin built of rough-hewn logs decades earlier. It slumped beneath the weight of winter like an old man stooping under unseen burdens. The roof sagged, its stones dark with moss. The shutters dangled half-broken, and the chimney leaned as if deciding whether to fall. To an outsider it might have looked abandoned, but to Robert it was the last inheritance of a family line dwindled to only him and Lily. He parked and turned off the engine. Silence pressed in immediately, vast and heavy. Only the wind spoke, rattling through the pines. Robert drew in a breath of cold that cut his lungs, then exhaled slowly, watching the mist vanish. He glanced at Lily, who sat motionless, clutching her sketchbook to her chest as if it were armor. "We're here," he said, his voice gravelly, threaded with uncertainty he would never admit. She turned her head, eyes flickering toward the cabin, but gave no reply. Her lips parted as if she might say something, then closed again. Robert opened his door, boots crunching in snow, and circled around to help Lily down. She stepped lightly, her breath puffing white. The girl hugged her sketchbook tighter, and for a long moment she simply stared at the cabin. To her it must have looked like something from her drawings, a place both strange and forgotten. Robert placed a hand on her shoulder, heavy but gentle. "It's just us, kid. We'll make it work." She gave a tiny nod, though her expression betrayed doubt. Together, they trudged through snow toward the door, their steps uneven, his long and heavy, hers small and hesitant. The cabin door creaked when Robert forced it open, releasing a gust of air thick with dust and pine resin. Inside, time seemed to have paused. Furniture lay draped in gray sheets of age. A wooden table leaned on one leg, patched long ago with a block of stone. Shelves held mismatched mugs, their rims chipped. A fireplace, blackened by soot, yawned wide, cold, and waiting. Robert set their bags near the hearth and surveyed the room with a soldier's eye, cataloging repairs, threats, possibilities. He imagined his father's hands building these walls, remembered his booming laughter, the way his voice filled a space without effort. That memory ached, but he did not let it show. He reached for a match, lit the fire, and watched smoke curl upward until warmth began to seep into the cold room. Lily drifted to the window, tracing shapes in the frost with one finger, her shoulders hunched as if to make herself invisible. Robert wanted to say something, anything that might reach her, but words were never his strength. He busied himself with unpacking instead, moving deliberately, methodically, as if military order might impose itself on this new life. As twilight deepened, the wind outside rose in a mournful howl, rattling the shutters. But inside, the fire grew steady. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, sketchbook open, pencil moving lightly across paper. Robert pretended not to watch her, though his eyes softened whenever he caught the curve of her drawings, trees, mountains, and faint outlines of a house that looked suspiciously like the cabin they now stood in. When the fire finally crackled bright, Robert lowered himself into a chair, his joints stiff. He rubbed his hands together, rough palms scarred from years of service, and murmured, "We'll be all right." He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Lily, to himself, or to the ghosts that seemed to hover within the old walls. Night fell fully, pressing black against the windows, and the cabin became a lone island of warmth amid the frozen wilderness. For the first time in many years, Robert allowed a flicker of hope to settle, fragile but real. Lily lay curled in her sleeping bag near the fire, her chest rising and falling with slow breaths. Robert sat awake longer, listening to the hiss of logs and the occasional groan of the roof. His eyes roamed the room, lingering on the shadows, the cracks, the old beams his father had carved. He thought of battles fought far away, of men he had lost, of his daughter buried too soon, and now, here, of the granddaughter entrusted to him. The cabin smelled faintly of pine smoke, dust, and something almost sweet memory, perhaps. Robert closed his eyes. In that silence, harsh yet soothing, he knew this was where their new life would begin. It would not be easy. Nothing worth keeping ever was, but he had survived worse. And as long as Lily was here, As long as they had even this broken cabin, there was a chance for rebuilding. Morning came with a pale, gray light, the kind that carried no warmth, only the promise of another long day in the Montana winter. Frost clung thick to the cabin's small windows, and smoke from the chimney curled weakly upward, quickly devoured by the cold air. Robert Hayes woke stiffly in his chair, his back aching from the wooden frame, his beard damp with condensation from falling asleep too close to the fire. He rubbed his eyes, pushing away the fog of restless dreams that had carried him back to deserts, explosions, and shadows of men he had once commanded. For a moment, he listened to the stillness, no gunfire, no shouting, only the crackle of dying embers. The silence was unnerving but also strangely peaceful. Lily stirred beneath her blanket on the floor. Her small frame shifted, her chestnut hair spilling over her cheeks, hiding her expression. She blinked against the light, then pulled her sketchbook closer to her chest, as if it had been her companion through the night. Robert studied her quietly. There was something fragile about her, as though grief had carved her into porcelain, beautiful, delicate, but easily broken. He wanted to reach across the years between them, but he feared his own roughness, his blunt soldier's nature, would only push her further away. The cabin felt larger in daylight, though no less worn. Dust swam in the air like tiny specters, stirred by their movements. Robert decided they needed to make the place livable. "We'll start by cleaning," he muttered, not sure if Lily would answer. She didn't. She simply rose, slid her feet into boots too big for her, and carried her sketchbook to the table, flipping it open to a page half filled with dark strokes of pencil. As Robert moved through the room, he began pulling away old sheets, exposing furniture that had survived years of neglect. He lifted a chair whose leg had snapped clean off. He examined it, thought of ways to fix it, and set it aside. He found an old trunk near the corner, heavy and carved with his father's initials, J.H. The sight stilled him. He hadn't seen it since he was a boy, when his father had stored hunting rifles and family papers inside. Robert crouched, his knees protesting, and worked the latch open. Inside lay a mix of forgotten relics, a woolen blanket, moth-eaten but still faintly smelling of cedar, a handful of tarnished brass buttons, and at the bottom a wooden box smaller than a loaf of bread, carved carefully with whorls and lines. The box felt familiar, as though his hands remembered it before his mind did. He opened it slowly, revealing a bundle of letters bound with twine. The envelopes were yellowed, the ink faded. Some bore his mother's careful cursive, others his father's heavier hand. Robert sat heavily on the floor, staring at the words. His parents had both died decades ago, their voices long silenced, yet here was proof that they had once spoken, once cared enough to write. He untied the bundle and pulled out the first letter. The handwriting belonged to his father, firm but rushed. The letter spoke of bills unpaid, of a harvest gone poorly, of long nights by the fire. It was not addressed to anyone. It seemed written but never sent, like words his father could not speak aloud. Robert's throat tightened. He remembered his father as a man larger than life, a hunter, a builder, a voice of command. But here, in shaky lines, he saw weakness, worry, and love hidden beneath pride. He traced the ink with calloused fingers. A memory returned of a day when he was 16, when his father caught him sneaking a cigarette behind the barn. Instead of shouting, his father had sat beside him, handed him another, and told him about the war he had fought, how sometimes men smoked not for pleasure, but to keep their hands from trembling. That memory stayed with Robert his whole life, shaping how he viewed strength, not as unbreakable steel, but as bent metal refusing to snap. Lily approached, silently, her boots tapping lightly on the wooden floor. She crouched beside him, her hazel eyes scanning the letters. She did not ask, but her gaze carried curiosity. Robert handed her one letter without a word. She took it gently, as if it might crumble in her hands, and studied the faded script. She could not decipher all the words, but she turned the envelope over, touching the initials carved into the box. For the first time since they arrived, Robert saw a flicker of connection in her expression, a thread between past and present, between family long gone and family still here. The day passed in quiet labor. Robert repaired what he could, sweeping dust and patching gaps in the floor with old boards. Lily drew in her sketchbook, occasionally glancing at the letters as if trying to capture them in lines of graphite. By late afternoon, she brought her drawing to Robert. It showed the cabin, but not as it was broken and sagging. Instead, she had drawn it upright, strong, with smoke rising from the chimney and light in the windows. In the snow outside stood two figures, one tall with a beard, the other small holding a book. Robert felt a pang in his chest. He did not know how to speak his gratitude, so he simply nodded, his voice rough. "That's good, Lily, real good." Evening fell quickly, shadows creeping across the room until only the fire kept them at bay. Robert sat at the table, sorting through more letters, while Lily curled up on the rug with her sketchbook open. He found one letter in his mother's hand, dated the year he had left for the army. It was addressed to him, but the envelope was never sealed. He unfolded it carefully. "My dear boy," it began, "I know you feel you must go. Your father and I cannot stop you, though it tears at us. If you are reading this, you are already gone. Know that you are loved. Know that no war, no distance can take that from us. I hope one day you come home to this cabin and find peace." Swallowed hard. His mother had died while he was still overseas. He had never known she wrote these words. He pressed the paper to his chest, closing his eyes against the firelight. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel not just the soldier, not just the veteran, but the son who had left and never truly returned. Lily watched him silently. She did not speak, but she set her sketchbook aside and walked over. She placed her small hand on his arm, light as a feather. Robert opened his eyes and met hers. They did not need words. In that moment, the silence was no longer empty. It was full of memory, of loss, of hope not yet extinguished. Outside, the wind swept across the valley. But inside the cabin, grandfather and granddaughter sat together, bound by old letters and new understanding. The cabin, though still broken, felt less abandoned. The ghosts of the past lingered, but they did not press as heavily, and in the glow of the fire, Robert allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this place could become a home again. The third night in the cabin descended heavy with snow, a silence so thick it pressed against the windows like a living thing. Outside, the world had vanished into a swirling white storm, the mountains hidden, the trees reduced to shadows cloaked in frost. The wind moaned across the valley, carrying with it flakes sharp as glass. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered stubbornly in the hearth, throwing amber light across the rough walls. Robert sat at the table, reading another of his mother's letters by the glow of a lantern, while Lily knelt on the rug, sketching by firelight. The stillness of the room was broken only by the scratch of pencil on paper and the occasional creak of wood shifting under the weight of snow. Robert had always believed silence was something to endure, but these nights were different. He had begun to sense that Lily's silence was not emptiness, it was protection, a fortress she had built around herself after too much loss. He wondered if he could ever breach it. He looked up as she paused, tilting her head toward the door. At first he thought it was nothing but the storm, but then he heard it too, a faint sound beneath the howling wind, a low, muffled cry, half growl, half whimper. Robert pushed back his chair, the soldier in him sharpening at once. He gestured for Lily to stay put, but the girl rose to her feet anyway, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. They moved toward the door together. The noise came again, louder now, a wounded sound that cut through the storm. Robert unlatched the door, and the cold rushed in like a flood, searing their lungs. Snow whipped across the threshold. There, sprawled on the porch in a heap of black and tan fur, lay a German shepherd. His body trembled violently, his ribs visible through a coat matted with blood and ice. His left flank bore a deep gash, the fur around it frozen stiff with crimson. His ears twitched weakly at the sight of them, and his amber eyes flickered open, sharp, intelligent, but clouded with pain. He tried to lift his head, then collapsed with a pitiful whine. Robert's breath caught. He had seen dogs like this before, not strays but soldiers. He knelt carefully, ignoring the ache in his knees, and studied the animal. The shepherd was large, likely 5 or 6 years old, the prime of working life. Even through the injury, Robert recognized the square build, the muscled shoulders, the disciplined bearing that no ordinary household pet carried. The dog bore Scar's old ones, faded but unmistakable along his muzzle and forelegs. This was no accident of wilderness. This was a creature shaped by training and hardship. "Easy, boy," Robert murmured, his voice low, steady, the tone he had once used in military kennels. The shepherd's ears flicked, recognizing authority even in weakness. Lily stood frozen beside him, her hazel eyes wide, breath misting in the cold. She looked at the dog with something between fear and wonder. Slowly, she knelt too, her small hands clutching the edges of her sketchbook. She whispered the first word Robert had heard from her in days. "Please." It was not clear if she was speaking to her grandfather, to the dog, or to the storm itself, but the word carried weight. Robert glanced at her, then back at the shepherd. Without hesitation, he slid his arms under the heavy body, grunting at the effort. The dog whimpered, but did not resist. He carried the animal inside, laying him on a quilt near the fire. The cabin filled with the sharp scent of blood and wet fur. Robert fetched an old first aid kit from his duffel bag, hands moving with the steadiness of habit. He had once trained combat medics, and though years had dulled his speed, the motions remained. He cleaned the wound with boiled water, then pressed cloth against it, binding it with strips of linen cut from an old shirt. The shepherd growled softly, but stayed still, his eyes locked on Robert with a strange, unspoken trust. Lily crouched close, her fingers brushing the dog's uninjured side. She did not flinch at the sight of blood, though her lips trembled. Her eyes softened as the shepherd's breathing slowed, settling into a ragged but steady rhythm. She opened her sketchbook, pencil moving across paper. In minutes, she had drawn the dog's face, eyes wide, ears pricked, a creature wounded but proud. She held the sketch up silently to Robert. He nodded once. "Ranger," he said suddenly, the name rising from memory of patrol calls and dogs who had saved lives. "We'll call him Ranger." The dog gave no sign of recognition, but his tail twitched faintly, a single sweep against the quilt. Lily whispered the name again, her voice barely more than breath. Ranger. It was the first time she had spoken twice in a single night since her mother's death. Robert felt a pang in his chest, something fragile stirring, As the storm raged outside, the three of them formed a circle by the fire, an old soldier haunted by battles, a girl locked in silence, and a wounded shepherd carrying scars of another life. Robert sat back, exhaustion pulling at his bones, and watched Lily stroke the dog's fur. For the first time since Anna's funeral, the girl's eyes shone with something alive. The night stretched on, filled with the crackle of fire and the steady breaths of Ranger. Outside, snow buried the world in white, but inside, the cabin held a flicker of warmth, fragile but real. Robert leaned his head against the chair, whispering into the stillness, "Maybe we're not alone after all." The storm passed by dawn, leaving the valley buried in silence. The snow piled high against the cabin walls like a fortress built overnight. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of smoke, blood, and wet fur. Ranger lay stretched on the quilt near the fire, his chest rising and falling in slow, uneven rhythm. His bandaged flank seeped faintly through the cloth, but the bleeding had stopped, and the animal's strength, though fragile, seemed to cling stubbornly to life. Robert Hayes knelt beside him, his broad hands steady as he checked the bindings, adjusting them with the precision of someone who had patched wounds in worse conditions. Robert's face was pale in the firelight, every crease carved deeper by fatigue. He studied the shepherd with narrowed eyes, the way he once studied men under his command, measuring not just their injuries but their will to keep going. This was no common stray. The discipline in the way Ranger held himself even in pain, the way his gaze never darted aimlessly but fixed steady on Robert, spoke volumes. As Robert leaned closer, his fingers brushed something hard beneath the dog's thick coat near the collar. He frowned, parting the fur until he saw it. A small metal tag, dull with scratches, hanging by a thin piece of wire. Carefully, he unhooked it, holding it up to the lantern light. The letters were worn but legible. U.S. Army K-9, Unit 312, Montana Division. Robert's stomach clenched. He knew the designation. He had served near that unit during his final years before retirement. For a long moment he sat frozen, memories uncoiling inside him like smoke. The desert Sunday, the bark of shepherds lunging at command, men shouting, dust rising, the crack of gunfire. He had seen dogs like Ranger leap into danger without hesitation, sniffing out explosives, dragging wounded soldiers to cover, refusing to abandon their handlers. He had trained with them, respected them, and he had watched them die. "Not just any dog, Robert," muttered under his breath. He ran a thumb over the scratched metal, his eyes distant. His chest tightened with an old ache, one he thought buried. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her sketchbook open in her lap. She had been drawing silently as Robert worked, her hazel eyes flicking between her grandfather and the dog. When Robert's voice cracked the quiet, she tilted her head, curious. She rose slowly and approached, her long hair spilling over her shoulders, cheeks still pale from the cold. She pointed at the tag in Robert's hand, her lips parting. "Army." The word startled him, not because she spoke, but because she asked. It was the first real question she had voiced to him since they'd arrived at the cabin. He swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "He was one of ours." Lily's brow furrowed as she stared at Ranger, who blinked slowly, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. "Like you?" she asked. Her voice was tentative, brittle, as though the words might break if she said them too loud. Robert shifted uncomfortably. He had never spoken to Lily about the war, not directly. He had kept his stories locked away, convinced they were too heavy for young ears. But here was a bridge he had not expected, a wounded shepherd carrying with him the same shadows Robert bore. He nodded again, slowly. "Like me." Something changed in Lily's expression then. The silence she carried like a shield cracked just slightly. She crouched beside Ranger, brushing her small hand carefully along the dog's uninjured side. "He came to us," she whispered, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Robert watched, his throat tight, as she continued softly, "Maybe Mom sent him." The words hit Robert like a blow. He looked away quickly, staring into the fire. He wanted to tell her not to cling to impossible hopes, that war dogs didn't appear out of nowhere for sentimental reasons. But he couldn't. Because for the first time since Anna's death, Lily's eyes shone with something more than grief, and he could not bring himself to extinguish that light. Later that day, when the storm quieted enough to venture outside, Robert bundled in his heavy coat and stepped into the frozen world to gather wood. The snow crunched under his boots, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. He worked methodically, his mind replaying the discovery of the tag. How had Ranger ended up here, 2 hours from the old base where Unit 312 had once been stationed? Retired military dogs were sometimes adopted, sometimes abandoned, but rarely left wandering into the wilderness. There had to be a story behind this. Inside, Lily sat by the fire with Ranger, her sketchbook resting on her knees. She drew the metal tag, carefully shaping the worn letters, then sketched her grandfather's hands holding it. For the first time, her drawings included words, small notes scribbled in the corners. Army dog, Grandpa's eyes, home. When Robert returned, shaking snow from his coat, he saw the sketches. He stood silently over her shoulder, his eyes softening. "You're good at that," he said. She startled, then looked up at him. Her cheeks flushed, but she did not turn the page to hide it. Instead, she asked, "Will he stay?" Robert hesitated. He had no answer. Ranger was wounded, his past uncertain, his presence a mystery. But as he watched the shepherd's tail thump faintly against the floor, as he saw the way Lily leaned against the dog with trust she rarely showed anyone, Robert finally nodded. If he wants to. That night, while Lily slept curled near the fire, Robert sat awake, the metal tag turning slowly in his hand. Ranger's steady breathing filled the cabin, a reminder of another life, another battlefield. Robert whispered into the shadows, "Guess you and me, old boy, we've both seen too much." The shepherd lifted his head briefly, eyes glinting, before settling again. And in that, the moment, Robert felt less alone with his ghosts. The snow had softened by midweek, loosening its grip on the valley. Though the cold lingered, the storm had broken, and sunlight finally pierced the clouds in thin, golden rays that glittered across the frozen trees. The air smelled sharper now, carrying the crisp tang of pine and the faint wetness of thaw. Robert Hayes shouldered his axe and stepped out into the clearing, his boots sinking into snow that reached halfway up his calves. He had intended only to gather firewood, but Ranger padded after him, limping slightly on his bandaged leg, ears pricked forward with intent. Robert paused, considering. "You should rest," he muttered. But the shepherd ignored him, nose to the ground, tail twitching as if some invisible thread pulled him forward. Behind them, Lily followed at a distance, wrapped in her thick coat, her sketchbook tucked under her arm as always. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her breath puffing in clouds. She was quiet, but Robert noticed the way her eyes followed Ranger closely, as if trusting the dog more than the trail. They trudged deeper into the forest, the sound of their boots muffled by snow. The pines stretched tall, their needles heavy, bending under frost. Robert swung his axe into a fallen branch, splitting it into manageable pieces, but his attention kept drifting to Ranger. The shepherd's movements had changed, no longer random wandering, but deliberate, a soldier on mission. He moved ahead, nose pressed low, then glanced back, his amber eyes sharp, beckoning them silently to follow. Robert's instincts, honed from years in uniform, tightened in his chest. He knew the look of a working dog who had caught scent of something important. He gripped the axe more firmly and motioned to Lily. "Stay close." She obeyed without question, small boots crunching quick steps to match his. Ranger led them down a slope where snow gathered deep in drifts, then veered toward a massive fallen pine. The trunk lay splintered, its roots jutting into the air like a crown of jagged fingers. The shepherd sniffed furiously around its base, then began to dig, snow flying in frantic sprays from his powerful paws. Robert set down the axe and approached. His pulse quickened. Ranger's growl rumbled low, not in threat but in urgency, until finally his claws scraped against something harder than soil. Robert dropped to his knees, brushing away the snow. His calloused hands struck metal. It was a rusted steel box, the kind used decades earlier to store ammunition or supplies. The paint had long since flaked away, leaving only dull patches of green. Robert stared at it, his breath shallow. He pried at the latch, stiff with rust, until it gave with a sharp snap. The lid creaked open. Inside lay a small bundle of objects wrapped in oilcloth. Robert lifted it carefully, his hands trembling despite himself. He unrolled the cloth on the snow, revealing its contents. A handful of black and white photographs curled at the edges, a letter folded neatly, though yellowed with time, and a single tarnished medal gleaming faintly in the weak light. Robert picked up the photographs first. They showed men in uniform, faces young and hard, their helmets tilted against the Sunday. Dust swirled around them, rifles slung across shoulders. He knew the terrain desert plains, far from Montana. His throat tightened as he recognized insignias, names scrawled on the backs. These were American soldiers, captured in moments of fatigue and grim determination. Lily crouched beside him, her mittened hands hovering above the pictures as though afraid to touch. She tilted her head, her eyes wide. "Grandpa?" she whispered, voice small. Robert's eyes locked on one photo near the bottom of the stack. His breath stopped. It was his unit, and there, in the corner of the frame, half obscured by shadow, stood his son, Daniel Hayes, tall, broad-shouldered, with his mother's dark hair and his father's piercing gaze. Daniel had died. Overseas nearly 15 years earlier, a casualty of a roadside bomb, Robert had buried his boy with military honors, the folded flag pressed into his hands by men in dress uniform. But here was a picture he had never seen Daniel alive, smiling faintly, his arm around another soldier. Robert's vision blurred. He pressed the photograph to his chest, his shoulders shaking. For the first time in years, he let the grief spill out, hot tears steaming against the cold air. His body trembled with the weight of it, his voice cracking as he whispered his son's name. Lily stared, stunned. She had never seen her grandfather cry. To her, Robert was carved from stone, a man of iron and silence. Now, as his tears fell onto the snow, she reached out hesitantly, placing her small hand over his. "It's okay," she said softly. The words, though few, carried more than she had spoken in months. Robert drew a shaky breath and forced himself to look at the folded letter. The paper was brittle, but the handwriting struck him like a hammer. It was Daniel's. The lines were brief, written in hurried script. "Dad, if this finds you, know I did my best. Tell Lily." The words ended abruptly, the page torn. Robert's hands clenched, the missing lines burning holes in his heart. At the bottom of the bundle lay the medal, a bronze star, tarnished but unmistakable. Daniel's award. Robert closed his fist around it, the cold metal biting into his palm. Ranger whined softly, nudging Robert's shoulder, as if sensing the storm of emotion tearing through the man. Robert sat back in the snow, staring at the artifacts of a life gone. His son's face, his son's words, his son's courage all buried here in a rusted box, waiting to be uncovered by a wounded shepherd. He had lived with grief for so long that it had hardened into silence, but now the wound was torn open again. Lily leaned against him, her head resting on his arm. She said nothing more, but her presence anchored him. For the first time, Robert let himself weep freely, his breath shuddering in the cold air. Above them, the sky cleared, revealing a pale blue stretched thin over the mountains. The forest stood hushed, as if holding its breath for their grief, and in that quiet, Robert felt the weight of the past pressing hard, but also a flicker of something else, the sense that maybe this discovery, painful as it was, could become a step toward healing. The Montana sky darkened quickly, faster than Robert Hayes expected. What had begun as a pale winter afternoon, sunlight glinting faintly across the snow, shifted into a menacing gray. The trees groaned under the rising wind, and clouds gathered like troops assembling for battle. Robert had lived enough winters to know what was coming. He set down the bundle of photographs and letters from the box they had unearthed, his breath steady but heavy. "We need to head back," he said, his voice firm. Lily nodded, her eyes wide, hugging her sketchbook against her chest as if afraid the wind might tear it away. They trudged up the slope toward the cabin, Ranger padding beside them, his limp less noticeable now that adrenaline fueled his movements. The shepherd's ears flicked constantly, alert to every sound. Snowflakes began to fall, at first gentle, then faster, until the air thickened with white. By the time they reached the clearing near the cabin, the storm had arrived in full force. Wind howled through the valley, hurling snow sideways, erasing landmarks in seconds. Robert gritted his teeth. His body, though still strong, no longer carried the endurance of his younger days. Every step felt heavier, the cold sinking deep into his bones. He turned to check on Lily, who struggled against the gusts, her small frame nearly swallowed by the storm. She kept her eyes locked on him, determination etched into her pale face. But in one blink, Ranger shot forward, barking into the blizzard, his figure vanishing into the wall of snow. "Ranger!" Robert shouted, his voice whipped away. Lily hesitated only a moment before she darted after the shepherd. "Lily, wait!" Robert's cry tore from his throat, but the storm swallowed her. Panic surged through him, hot and choking. He dropped the bundle he carried, sprinting as fast as his legs allowed, but the snow blinded him, erasing her tracks almost as soon as they were made. His heart hammered painfully, each beat reminding him of his age, of the body that had endured too much already. But fear drove him on. He imagined the cold closing around Lily, imagined her small hands clutching her coat, her breath weakening. He could not lose her, not after losing Daniel, not after Anna, not again. The storm thickened. Robert stumbled against a fallen branch, his knee slamming into ice, but he pushed himself up, cursing under his breath. His beard was crusted with frost, his fingers numb even inside his gloves. He called Lily's name again and again, each shout weaker, his voice cracking into the wind. Then, through the roar of the storm came a bark, strong, urgent, Ranger. Robert staggered toward the sound, following it like a lifeline. The shepherd appeared in flashes between gusts, his black and tan coat stark against the snow, his eyes bright with command. He barked once more, then turned, leading Robert forward. Each time Robert faltered, the dog circled back, pressing against his leg, urging him onward. Finally, through a break in the storm, Robert saw a small figure huddled beneath the branches of a fallen tree. Lily, curled into herself, trembling violently, snow piled against her coat. Her cheeks were ashen, her lips tinged blue, her eyes wide but unfocused. Robert fell to his knees beside her, scooping her into his arms. "I've got you," he rasped, his chest heaving. "I've got you, kiddo. I'm not letting go." Lily blinked, her gaze slowly sharpening as she recognized him. A faint sound escaped her lips, his name broken but real. Grandpa. It was the first time she had called him that aloud. The word split his heart open, flooding him with both grief and relief. He pressed his forehead against hers, tears freezing on his lashes. "You're safe," he whispered fiercely. "You hear me? You're safe. I won't lose you." Ranger pressed close, his body shielding them from the worst of the wind. His breath steamed heavily, his sides heaving, but he stayed planted, immovable as a wall. Robert shifted Lily against his chest, wrapping his coat around her, then rose with a groan. His legs burned, his lungs raw, but he tightened his hold. Step by step, guided by Ranger's steady pace, he carried her back through the storm. By the time the cabin loomed out of the white, Robert's body screamed with exhaustion. He stumbled inside, slamming the door shut against the gale. Heat rushed at them from the fire still burning in the hearth, though it felt faint against the chill that had seeped into their bones. Robert laid Lily near the flames, stripping off her wet coat and rubbing her arms briskly to restore warmth. Ranger collapsed beside her, curling his body close, his eyes half closed but vigilant. Robert knelt, his hands trembling as he covered Lily with blankets. She shivered violently at first, then slowly eased, her breathing evening out. He sat back, chest heaving, his vision blurring with both fatigue and relief. He reached for her hand, small and pale against his scarred palm, and held it tightly. "Never again," he whispered, voice raw. "I will never let you slip away. You are all I have left, Lily, you and that stubborn dog." Outside, the storm raged on, battering the cabin with icy fists. But inside, amid the crackle of fire and the steady heartbeat of survival, a vow had been made. For Robert Hayes, the choice was final. No matter the cost, he would protect his granddaughter. He would not fail her. Not again. Winter in Montana does not surrender quickly. Even in March, the nights remained long and bitter, and the mornings carried a frost that bit at exposed skin. Yet slowly, as the weeks passed, the storm-racked valley softened. Snow melted into streams that trickled down the slopes, the ground yielding patches of brown earth. The cabin, once imprisoned by white walls of ice, began to breathe again beneath a sky painted in hues of pale blue and the first hints of green. Robert Hayes rose each day with stiff joints and aching muscles, but there was a new rhythm to his life now. He patched shingles on the roof, his broad hands steady on the hammer despite the scars etched into them. He repaired the sagging porch, teaching Lily how to hold nails steady while he drove them in with careful swings. At first she was clumsy, her small fingers fumbling, but her determination shone in her hazel eyes. Robert, patient in a way he had never been as a soldier, guided her without harshness. "Slow, steady," he said, and when she finally placed the nail right, he gave her a rare smile that crinkled the corners of his blue eyes. Lily herself was changing. The grief-weighted silence that had once wrapped her was thinning. She laughed sometimes, now short bursts that startled both of them. She asked questions about the world outside the valley, about her grandfather's youth, even about the war. Robert answered carefully, never with details too dark, but enough to show her he was human, not just a stone monument to discipline. Her cheeks flushed with color more often, her long chestnut hair catching the sunlight as she ran in the clearing with Ranger at her heels. Ranger, though still carrying the scar of his wound, moved with renewed strength. His coat grew glossier with care, black and tan catching the light. He watched over Lily with fierce loyalty, pacing beside her, curling near her bed at night, barking sharply at shadows that moved too close to the cabin. He was no ordinary dog. Robert knew that with certainty now. He was a guardian, a soldier still, though one who had chosen their family as his unit. One bright morning, Robert led Lily to the edge of the clearing where the soil had thawed. "This is where your grandmother used to plant her garden," he explained, his voice softer than usual. "We'll do the same. Something fresh, something alive." He knelt, showing her how to dig the earth, his broad hands surprisingly gentle as they turned the soil. Lily mimicked him, her laughter spilling into the crisp air when Ranger shoved his nose into the dirt and sneezed loudly. Together, the three of them planted seeds, tiny, fragile things that seemed absurd against the vast wilderness. Yet Robert felt a quiet hope as he pressed the soil down. Life, he thought, always begins small. Spring carried them forward, and with it came a summons from the small town nestled 20 miles down the valley. Once a month, the townsfolk gathered in the community hall for a simple service of remembrance and thanksgiving. Robert had long avoided such gatherings, preferring solitude, but this time Lily asked to go. She had written something, she told him, her voice shy but steady. On the day of the gathering, they drove into town in the old green pickup. The hall was modest, a wooden structure with peeling white paint and a bell that clanged unevenly when rung. Inside, rows of benches faced a small platform draped with the American flag. The townsfolk were ordinary people hardened by Montana winters, men in work jackets, women with sun-creased faces, children fidgeting in their Sunday clothes. Among them was Pastor Whitman, a man in his late 50s, tall and thin, with graying hair and a face weathered by both laughter and sorrow. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had buried friends and welcomed new lives with equal grace. He greeted Robert with a nod of respect, then bent to speak kindly to Lily, his brown eyes warm. "We're glad you're here," he said, and she gave him a timid smile. When it came time for reflections, Pastor Whitman invited anyone forward. To Robert's surprise, Lily rose. She clutched a folded sheet of paper in her small hands, her knees knocking slightly as she walked to the front. Robert's chest tightened, pride and fear warring inside him. Ranger, lying at Robert's feet, lifted his head, ears forward, as though standing guard for her. Lily unfolded her paper with trembling fingers. At first, silence stretched, the kind that once would have crushed her. But then she lifted her chin, her hazel eyes bright, and began to read in a clear, wavering voice. "My grandfather and I came here this winter to a cabin that felt broken. We thought we were just surviving. But we found more than shelter. We found Ranger, a dog who carries scars like us. We found letters, memories, and things that hurt but also heal. We found that silence can break if you listen closely enough. And I found my grandpa." She paused, her voice catching, then finished softly. "We did not just find a home. We found each other again." The hall fell silent, save for the creak of benches and the sound of someone quietly wiping away tears. Robert bowed his head, his hand gripping Ranger's fur tightly. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to feel not only sorrow, but gratitude. His granddaughter's voice had carried his own healing further than he thought possible. As they left the hall that evening, the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. Robert placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, steady and warm. She leaned against him, smiling faintly. Ranger trotted ahead, his tail swaying, the silent sentinel who had brought them here. For Robert Hayes, the war within his heart was not gone, but at last he no longer fought it alone. Sometimes miracles do not come as thunder or lightning from the heavens. Sometimes they arrive quietly like a wounded dog who will not give up, a granddaughter's fragile voice breaking her silence, or the strength of an old soldier who still dares to love. Robert, Lily, and Ranger remind us that God's grace often works in the hidden places of our lives, restoring what we thought was broken beyond repair. And maybe that is the greatest miracle of all, not the absence of storms, but the way faith, love, and loyalty carry us through them. As Scripture says, He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. Each of us has wounds, yet each of us also has the chance to become part of God's healing in the lives of others. So, as you go about your own daily life, whether in the noise of the city or the quiet of the countryside, remember that small acts of courage, kindness, and faith can be the very tools through which God shapes miracles. Before you leave, share this story with someone who might need hope tonight. Leave a comment telling us what this story means to you, and subscribe to join us for more stories of faith, loyalty, and love. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may His light guide your path just as He guided Robert, Lily, and Ranger through the storm to spring again.